Welcome to the podcast ABCs of Parenting Adult Children. Please join us as we discuss parenting adult children and the unique struggles that it comes along with.
Hello and welcome to the ABCs of Parenting Adult Children. I'm your host, James Moffitt. Joining me today is a celebrity guest, Deana Thayer with Focus on the Family. Hey, Deana.
Hi there.
Hey. So you're with Focus on the Family, and you're known for your thoughtful, values-based approach to family coaching and parenting strategy. In this episode, we'll dive into the tools and truths that empower parents to lead with clarity as their children grow and grow up. So, Deana, why don't you introduce yourself to the listening audience?
Sure. As you said, my name is Deana Thayer. I'm one of the marriage and parenting associates at Focus on the Family. I also serve in the communications department here, so I help really connect our work with the outside world. And that's really wonderful and gratifying just because we love being able to save marriages and equip parents. And I'm actually a pretty newly minted empty nester myself. So your podcast really speaks to an issue that I'm living. I'm in this season. I care deeply about not only raising children who become functioning and contributing adults, but I'm in the season of having young adult children myself. And I enjoy getting to come alongside families and hopefully equip them to feel empowered to do a great job.
Well, being an empty nester it's definitely a new chapter in the life of parents. And we transition, they're toddlers, they're preteens, they're young adults, teenagers. Let's not forget the teenagers. And, we as parents have to learn how to transition from one stage to the next. And a lot of parents, their kids go off to college or they buy homes or they have a career, they leave the nest, which is what we ultimately want them to do at some point, right? To be self-sustaining, good humans that are out in society doing their thing, right? And hopefully staying in contact with their parents. And then the parents are looking at each other going, who are you and what are we doing here, right? They're like, because their identity is just, dramatically changed. They're so much of your identity as a parent is wrapped up in raising your kids, right? And helping your kids become the type of adults that we would be proud of, out in the world. So I'm going to read this little blurb that you got here on Focus on the Families. Deana Thayer. Deana Thayer is a podcaster, speaker, and author with over 2 decades of experience in the marriage and parenting sphere. She originally served as a doula and childbirth educator before moving into parent coaching and podcasting, most recently appearing on Focus on the Family, Crazy Little Thing Called Marriage. For the past decade, Deana and her husband, Scott, have drawn on their step-family experience to lead blended family ministry through premarital coaching, mentoring, and small group facilitation. Deana and Scott are newly minted empty nesters with 5 young adult children. Wow, 5. That's crazy.
It is a lot. And we have 5 between us. So adding the complexity of our blended family certainly made some of those teen years really special. When we met, our kids were 7, 8, 9, 10, and 12. So we really went through it. We had many years with 5 teenagers in the home.
Oh my gosh. I shudder at the thought. So tell me a little bit about your parenting story. I mean, you just kind of told us that you had 5 kids. Tell us about how you and Scott met and all of that.
Sure. Yeah, it's been a journey. Of course, I had my first marriage, and so I had my 2 biological children with me during those times. And then I spent 6 years as a single mom, and that is a tall order. Kudos to any single parents because that is no joke. And then I actually met Scott through a mutual friend, and it was beautiful. God's kind in that way. He took kind of the hardest parts of each of our divorces, and that was how we met this mutual friend. So that's pretty special. And once we met, and he had been a youth pastor for 14 years. So I got to see that he really cared about young people. That really mattered to me as someone who was going to go into parenting with this person.
Sure.
And we just celebrated 13 years of marriage with a vow renewal. And that seems a little funny to do it on year 13, but we did that because that was the year it became the longest marriage for both of us. So we just really wanted
Aw.
to make that a landmark moment. His first marriage was 12 years long. So neither of us had had a 13th anniversary before until this
Okay.
year. So that's pretty special. And getting into parent coaching was just a natural extension of the things I care about. You read my little bio there. I was in the expectant parenting world, helping families with their birth and preparing for that. And then something was just bugging me about it. I loved it. It was beautiful, but it's a little bit akin to how much we prepare for a wedding, for example. We want people to be doing premarital coaching and they plan their wedding and the flowers and all the things, but how are we helping them prepare for the marriage? And I started to feel the same way. I loved being part of birth. It was a special thing, but I thought I really want to walk alongside people once they're parenting that little baby and helping shape it into the person that they hope they'll be when they grow up. And that's how I made that shift into the parent coaching side of things and the parenting podcast that I was able to do.
So do you have your own individual parenting podcast, or is it through Focus on the Family?
My podcast is all done, sadly. One of the most beautiful seasons of my life, but my co-host got an amazing job offer that even I said, you need to take it. So we recorded for 5 seasons and then we continued to pay for syndication for some time so that parents could still find the show.
Right.
And it really matches what you're doing. I love what you're doing because the premise, our podcast was called Raising Adults. So the premise was rather than raising a 30-year-old who's still on your couch playing video games, how do we parent with the future in mind, with a future focused mindset so that we're actually raising fully functioning, capable, contributing members of society eventually. And
Right.
that's what I care greatly about.
All right. Well, that's great about the podcast. After the episode, I'll get you to email me the link to it so I can share it with the listening audience. So I've got some questions that we can run through. I think. Well, I was going to tell you, my wife and I, we've been married 35 years, and we have 4 children that left the nest one way, shape, or
Okay.
another, right? And I have one son that both of my last 2 children, we lost 2 of our children to complications, cancer, and other things. And so my son Justin, and I probably shouldn't say his name on air. Anyway, I already let the cat out of the bag. But my son and my daughter were teenagers back in 2015, and they were doing the typical teenage thing, and they dropped out of high school. And of course, we freaked out about that, and we're like, "Oh, what are you doing?" And he went on to get his GED. They both went and got their GED. And my son went to Trident Technical College and got his 2-year degree. Went to College of Charleston, got his 4-year degree. Then he went to law school up in Virginia for 3 years, and now he's a practicing attorney. So we're very proud of both of them, but I'm especially proud of him and what he's done with his life and the direction he's taking it. He's doing very well for himself. So anyway, that's kind of a little bit of background on my parenting story.
That's neat because you
And
just
this is my
illustrated how most
this is
things are
my
not worth freaking out about.
do what?
You just illustrated that most things we freak out about end up over time not being worth freaking out about.
Right. Well, when they did that, my wife's a special ed teacher. She's got a master's degree. She's got a bachelor's degree. She's very highly educated, and she's been doing special ed teaching for 25, 30 years. Loves it. We're both in our 60s, and we looked at her kids, and it's not like we sat around and smoked dope or had alcohol parties all night. We both worked jobs. We both went to school, after work, online school, in-person school, and so we felt like we were modeling, to our children the things that's necessary to be successful in life, right? And when they just dropped out of high school, I was like, "What? Where is this coming from?" But anyway, we got past that, and they're both doing pretty good. So here's question number 1, and there will be a multiple choice exam at the end of this. No, I'm kidding. That's for you, listening audience. I want to see if you're paying attention. No, I'm just kidding. So, what are some of the biggest challenges parents face when their children transition into adulthood?
How long is the show? I'm kidding. There's several though, to be fair. I think some are on the side of the adult children and some are on the side of the parents. So challenges for the kids is asserting independence. They're trying to individuate from their parents and figure out
Right.
where does my parent end and where do I begin? That's a big challenge for them to take on. Other issues that they often have is around what now gets jokingly called adulting. So figuring out, how do I manage maybe my finances, or how do I decide where to live, or how do I navigate friendships? Those are all pieces of being an adult. Setting up your own dentist appointment, that even can be a challenge if they're not used to or haven't flexed the muscle of trying some of that out by themselves. And that's why I'm a big fan of start letting your kids and having your kids do that while they're still home. So
Right.
it's not such a shock. That's really helpful. And then there's challenges for the parents, though, too. And that is transitioning from being an authority in the child's life to more of just an influence. Hopefully, you will still have influence and you'll be able to speak into their life and be an important person that they would still choose to come to. But that can be a tricky transition. And I think sometimes, particularly for moms who can get their identity quite wrapped up in being a parent, that is a real challenging thing to let go of, and to say, you know what, I need to move into the identity of more of a coach and not
Right.
the authority over the child. And then we need to acknowledge that there's loss. There's actually empty nest syndrome now has been identified because there's actual grieving that takes place as parents make this transition. So those are just a couple of the challenges I see on both sides of the coin there.
So, what role does faith play in navigating the parent adult child relationship?
Well, I think if you have a faith paradigm, your faith is going to play a large role, because so much of this letting go process is also understanding, at least for me as a Christian, probably for people with other faith paradigms, it's also about trusting God with your child and knowing that there's a point at which your influence may not ever end, but it really changes considerably. And so we have to be able to rest in knowing that, wow, God loves my child even more than I do, which is really hard to fathom, but to trust that because he loves them, he wants what's best for them and he's got it. And I think that for a type A person like me, that's not always easy, but I had to really work to say, part of this letting go is also entrusting my children to God's good care as they transition into early adulthood.
Right. How can parents set healthy boundaries with their adult children, especially when they still live at home?
The boundaries thing is probably the biggest struggle, because there can be even a little bit of a power struggle between that adult child and the parent. So, a couple things that are really helpful, especially if your child is still at home, is there do have to be boundaries. Let me say that first. So, you asked about how to set them. I think there's parents who would even question, do we even have to have any? Yes, you do, or it gets very muddy
Right.
and the line will get too blurry over who's in charge, whose house is it. So it does have to be clear that it's your home. And I often encourage parents that I'm coaching to be bold about, it's okay to have house rules. It's okay to expect courtesy. So a couple of examples with that are, you could choose to have some kind of a financial component. And that might mean that you just want your child to have some skin in the game, especially if, say, they're working full time but living at home. They have an income. So even if it's just a token and it's more symbolic of adulting, charging the child rent might make some sense. We actually charged our kids rent, but set it aside and then gave it to them when they moved out. They didn't know we were doing that, but
Right.
we actually set it aside so they had a good little starting point to make maybe a deposit on an apartment or what have you. And yet, while they were living with us, they still had to go through the motions of, I'm paying to be here. It's not free hot water and electricity and all the things. So that's one thing that parents can consider as a boundary, some financial boundaries. Maybe in other areas, you might have your adult child contribute to the groceries or something like that. So that's one category. Another one I think falls under what I mentioned about consideration. If it's your home, certainly if you have a 24-year-old at home, it might feel really demeaning for them to have to ask you if they can go out with their friends. So maybe you remove that and say, you're allowed to tell us what's happening, but we do expect you to tell us, so that we kind of know when to expect you to come home. We aren't wondering what's going on. Because let's be honest, there's something different about when your child's under your own roof and it's 2 a.m. and you haven't seen them yet. The worry is different compared to the out of sight, out of mind college student. They might be out till 2, but you didn't know it. So there is
Right.
just still something different about that. And I think it's okay for parents to say, as a consideration, just like you would give consideration to a housemate or a roommate, you let us know kind of when to expect you. Will you be home for dinner? Those kinds of things. That's different than asking permission, but it still really connotes some respect for the parents.
Well, when we had young adults living with us, I kind of set a boundary in that, your mom and I go to work at 8 in the morning or 9 in the morning. We don't get home till 6 or 7 o'clock, depending on traffic. And I'm like, I told my kids, I said, I lock the doors at 11 o'clock and we go to sleep. I turn on the alarm, lock the doors. And so if you're not going to be home by midnight, I think I said midnight. I said, if you're not going to be home at midnight, I don't want to be awakened in the middle of the night by an alarm going off and me grabbing a gun, going looking for the intruder, right? I certainly don't want to shoot one of my children I do love, right? And so if you're not going to be home by midnight, this place is locked down, we're asleep, we don't want to be disturbed, go crash on somebody's couch or recliner or something until the morning. And so I kind of set that boundary. And of course, they didn't like that. They just wanted to come and go as they pleased. And I was like, no. And it's just consideration, being considerate of
Exactly.
one another as family members. And so they're, parents are not sitting around at 1 o'clock in the morning going, oh my God, I don't know where my child is. They're not responding to texts. They're not answering their phone. Are they in the emergency room? Are they in jail or in an accident? All these horrible scenarios start running through your head. And so it's only considerate for them to let where they're at and that they're okay. And I think that young adults are, they look at it as, oh, they're just trying to control me and they're trying to tell me what to do, and I don't want them to know where I'm at and what I'm doing, blah blah blah. And so it's kind of I guess it's kind of a power struggle there, but that's the reason why you set that boundary.
It is. Yeah, absolutely. And the way you did it, that's just a twist on a similar idea. So you're saying, hey, we need to get our rest because we're working. So after a certain point, don't try to come back. It's just a twist on a similar boundary that falls under that consideration and respect. Exactly.
All right, so let's jump to questions on blended families. You spoke about blended families earlier, and I think that's a topic that's not really highlighted much or spoken about too much. I think a lot of people when they think about, well, I'll speak about 60-year-olds. I was raised in the 70s, graduated high school in May of 1980, and so back in the 60s and the 70s, when you talk about family, you're talking about moms and dads and, you know, children. Typically it's the same race, and you didn't have, I didn't know of a blended family when I was in high school or grade school for that matter, so now that, in 2025, or at the turn of the 21st century, it became more of a thing, right? And it's more, I guess it's more acceptable. There's not a taboo attached to it or anything like that or a stigma. Back then, there was a huge stigma back in the 60s, and luckily we've all grown up and gotten past that, right? At least most of us have. Hopefully, most of us have, right?
Hopefully.
I
Yeah.
want to give as many people as much credit as possible here. So, what unique challenges do blended families face when parenting adult children?
Well, I mean, the big one is that it's possible that not all the children in the home are your biological children. And so your ability to affect change with those young adults is different. That's just the reality. My three stepchildren have grown to love and respect me. We have a great relationship, but there's still areas of their life I can't speak into the way that my husband can because he's their dad. And
Right.
that's an ongoing challenge. Now, certainly time really helps with this. When you're a step family, the longer you're together, the more the parents just feel like parents and it's not as big of a deal. But man, in those early years, it's tough because you don't have earned authority just by virtue of being related by blood. You really
Right.
have to work at it and earn it over time. And so Scott and I have just a policy that we speak into each other's lives, but anything that's going to be hard to hear to an adult child comes from the biological parent. And that just has saved us a lot of conflict by just doing that down biological lines if there's a harder conversation to have.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, I think that stepchildren, they're kind of thrust into that position. They didn't ask for that. right?
Exactly.
And so they're like, I think there's a little bit of underlying resentment there. They're like, great, well, I have a new mom or a new dad, and I have to respect them and be kind to them, but I don't have to like them, and I don't have to listen to them, right? And so yeah, it is tough. It's tough for the kids as well as the parent.
It is. And you're exactly right. They didn't ask for it. So we have to be sensitive to that. And that just takes time and grace, a lot of grace for each other while the kids are still maybe grieving the loss of their parents aren't together anymore, or maybe there's been the death of a parent. There has to be room for that. And they deserve to get to feel that loss. And it just takes time. So I love that you said they didn't ask for it. It's one of the key elements that parents and step parents need to be aware of. Might be a great thing for you, your remarriage, but maybe your kids aren't seeing it as a positive, at least not at first.
Right, right. It reminds me of the Partridge Family. The big colorful bus with those 8 children and a nanny. They had a nanny. They had it
Yeah,
good.
well, and even decades ago, we saw a blended family on TV with the Brady Bunch, which is amazing.
Right.
But
Right.
yeah,
I wonder if everybody kind of got that. I wonder if they were like,
I don't know if everybody clocked that because it was not as prevalent for sure.
right. Well, and I think blended families, not only when we talk about blended, we talk about, people that are married, remarried, bringing their own families together, right, as a cohesive unit. But to take it a step further, you may have, let's say, a Caucasian parent with a non-Caucasian parent with non-Caucasian children, right? So there are some racial barriers and intricate issues that go along with that, which we don't have to get into that here, but
And that can happen even in a first marriage. My first
right,
marriage,
that's true.
I wasn't married to a white person. Now I'm married to a Caucasian, but I wasn't the first time. So, and I would say, even like you said, with decades going by, what is taboo or whatever, even when my parents were growing up, very different than now.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It was, there was a huge stigma over all that back in the 60s. Let's just say racism was alive and well back then. Some people would probably argue that it's alive and well today. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Or I don't think it's as prevalent or as strong as it was back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Anyway, I'll go out on a limb and say that here. What are some practical ways to foster unity in a blended family, especially during holidays or major life events?
Okay, I've got a couple ideas here that have really been helpful for us. And the first one is you've got to communicate with the kiddos about their traditions that they had before in their quote first family so that you don't risk shutting down a way of doing something that's really meaningful to them. My husband and I stepped in it big time our first Christmas. We had not talked about how the families opened gifts. And the two families, my family and with my first marriage, his family, they did it very differently. And so we really risked upsetting our kids with why is this so different? So that's a thing you've got to do. Talk to each other, but also invite conversation with the kids and find those things out. And you might have to compromise. That's what we had to do. The second thing, and this is equally, if not more important, is then you create some of your own new traditions because that really bonds you as a family. So we ended up doing some things around the holidays that weren't part of our traditions with either of those first families, and they became really special and meaningful. We also created a family nickname that kind of bonded us. So this is our identity as a new blended family. I really encourage that, whether that's just combining the last names of the two people. I've seen that done, or if you just come up with something else. But bonding is important, especially in a blended family, because you're having to manufacture it. Again, it doesn't come automatically through that blood relationship.
All right, you said a family nickname. Is that something you can share?
Yes. So our blended family nickname is TD7, and that's because my husband's last name is Thayer, and of course so are his children. My biological children, their last name starts with a D, and there are 7 people in our family. So we go by TD7. It's even the name of our text thread together. Our family text thread is called TD7, and we can check in at restaurants as TD7. It just helped a lot with the bonding to have our little nickname. And we came up with it pretty early on. So it kind of helped
that's
out,
awesome.
just solidified us. Yeah.
That's cute. I never thought of that. So what inspired you to focus on intentional parenting and raising adults rather than just raising children?
Well, I shared part of that motivation earlier. It was the focused so much on the lead up when I was in the birth space that started to trouble me. But the other big piece about intentional parenting for me is that if you do things with intention, it does change the trajectory of these adults that we're talking about today. If you're winging it, so to speak, when you're parenting, I think we see a lot more of failure to launch. We see kids who are a little bit unmoored when they start adulting because there weren't foundational principles laid out while they were growing up. So parents have to be really intentional about what matters to us in our family, what are our values, and then do we actually parent toward those? For instance, you could say all day long, our family really values diligence. But if you aren't modeling diligence by doing your work faithfully at your job or even around the house, whatever it might be, kids are going to notice that mismatch and they're going to say, I'm not sure that is really what's important. But if you say, for example, integrity is important to us and you model that, it makes a difference. I still remember my kids were small. I left the grocery store, I'd already checked out, and I realized there was like a 12 pack of soda on the bottom part of the cart that they hadn't scanned. And I was able to give a real life example of the right thing is we're going to go back in and let them know about that because one of our family values is integrity, which means you're doing what's right even when no one's looking. So anytime we can model those things, that's called parenting with actual intention. And that's why I'm passionate about it. You've got to mean what you say and say what you mean if you're going to raise kids who become those responsible functioning adults.
Yeah, children learn about life, primarily through watching their parents, and a lot of parents, like my parents were like, don't do as I do, do as I say, and that flies okay if you're a toddler or if you're, 6, 7, 8 years old. But after that, after the child gets to the point that they can actually reason and think things through, all of a sudden they're like, wait, why are there two sets of rules? Why are there adult rules and then there's children rules,
Yep.
and if you carry that on, and if you don't model, we talked about marriage and the importance of a faith-based marriage and who the father is, who the mother is, what the roles are. And it's like if you want your kids to understand what it means to be kind, gentle, loving, passionate, a person of integrity, you have to model that in your marriage. Because if you don't, the kids are watching and they're like, okay. It's like you said, if you say that integrity is important, but you do things that don't reflect integrity, like not paying for that 6 pack of Coke or 12 pack of Cokes, right? If you just go, oh well, they missed it, so it's ours now. That's kind of unethical. Doesn't show a lot of integrity. What do the kids learn? They learn that, well, as long as you're not caught, it's okay, right? And that's not what we want to teach our kids. How has your work with Focus on the Family shaped your approach to parenting and family dynamics?
It's been an interesting full circle moment to be here, actually, because I grew up getting some focus on the family by osmosis. My mom listened to the radio program with Dr. Dobson as I was growing up. I actually got the magazine Brio for teen girls. So it's really interesting. If you had told me back then I would ever work for the organization, I would have thought, no way. And I just wouldn't have believed it. So focus has had an impact on my life even while I was growing up. So to be here now is really special. And I would say the way that focus has most impacted my approach to parenting is I think it's laced it with more grace because being at focus, I'm learning there are so many expressions even of faith-based parenting. People do it many different ways. And where we can find that common patch of grass to stand on, though, is often the why. It's the biblical worldview that we share, even if how we manifest that in our parenting looks a little different from household to household. And
Right.
I think I've just grown in grace for that and seeing there's different ways to do it. I obviously have strong feelings about parenting, and I do believe there are some things that are truly best practices.
Right.
But it is also nice to work in a faith-based organization and see that there's still variety.
So how did you come to be part of the Focus on the Family organization or family?
I moved here. I mean, that was a big part of it. I was coming from Washington State and I was moving to Colorado. So I started looking for jobs in Colorado. And of course,
Yeah.
Focus on the Family is here. And I started looking and I was so fortunate to find a role that really aligned my experience and my education with things that I care about. So I think that was just God's kindness as we were moving out of state to provide me with very meaningful work.
Yeah, what a huge blessing, right?
Yes.
So talk to us a little bit about your education.
Yes, my background. So, why I like doing things like this, for example, is my background combines education and speaking. So, my undergraduate degree is in speech communication. My master's is in education. I'm working on a doctorate in educational leadership because I care about educating couples, families, parents, and helping them, like I said at the top, feel equipped to do this well. I think sometimes parents really feel ill equipped, and we have a real, what I call an epidemic of child centered parenting going on in our country right now,
Right.
where parents are almost afraid to parent. And I'm passionate about helping parents feel equipped to be the parent and not be nervous about that role that they've been given by God. And so my education really speaks into that because I'm one of those rare people who does enjoy public speaking, and I care a lot about educating and equipping parents. So when I'm doing education work, even in academia, I'm not focused on the K to 12 space, grade
Right.
schoolers and all that. I'm looking at how do we educate adults because I care about exactly what we're talking about today. So that's kind of how my education plays into it.
All right, so let's segue into the role of parents and how the role of parents has changed. Let's say from 60s and
Mm.
70s on up into 21st century. What has happened to the parental role? How has it morphed, and how is it maybe bad?
Mm. It has shifted. And I mean, I wasn't alive during some of the decades you mentioned when you were talking about racism and stuff. I wasn't around, but I can say that parenting, I think there was a lot more comfort by the overall culture with parental authority. We were just more comfortable with it. And even adult authority, I would venture to say, because it wasn't rare for me growing up to even have maybe a neighbor correct me if I
Right.
wasn't doing something right. We were okay with that in our society. And now that is shifting quite a bit. Parents do not want other adults telling their kids what to do. They don't see that as a welcome. Hey, thanks for having my back. I'm making sure my kid is
Right.
behaving. It's really seen as an intrusion. And then what I spoke about a moment ago, the fear factor is really creeping in, whereas parents felt, I think, confident. Hey, I am, quote, the boss. And they didn't mind putting boundaries up, and discipline wasn't as challenging. And now we have a real generation of parents who are working so hard to be their child's friend that they're really missing the boat on some key parenting stuff. That's what I'm seeing, even as a parent coach. And now being in this sphere for about 2 decades is a real shift to almost being nervous. Well, but I don't want to upset my child. And I think that's the wrong goal. If you're aiming at happiness, it's the wrong goal.
Right.
We can't control whether our kids are happy anyway. But what we do want to aim at is, are we going to help them navigate the world successfully? And that
Right.
might mean we upset them a time or two as we teach them. And that's really what it is. It's not being a stinker. I'm not saying go and be this authoritarian, horrible person to your children, but you're your children's first and best teacher. And so when we fail to train our kids, we're really setting up the next generation to not be able to succeed in the world. It's not a fair depiction of what life is really like. If we keep solving all their problems for them, if we're afraid to put down boundaries, they're getting a false picture of the world. And that's what is sad for me and why I do the work I do, because I think that does kids a disservice, really.
I think back in the earlier generations, I can only speak to what I was raised up in, in the 60s and 70s. A lot of times, grandparents lived with the parents, right? In other words, back then, I think it was just understood that it takes a village to raise people, is children and adults, right? It takes a village. It takes all of us, whether it be grandparents, parents, the YMCA, what other, the church, whatever organizations that our children were part of. It was kind of just understood that, hey, these young people need direction. They need structure in their lives. They need role models in their lives that
Right.
can teach them the same principles that we're trying to teach them at home, right? And I think that I know that back then there was a definite parent-child relationship, and we weren't. My parents were not trying to be my friend. My dad was a drill instructor for 26 years. My mother was
Oh,
European. She was from Austria. They were that stereotypical authoritarian family. Like, you do what you're told or there's going to be consequences. A lot of times the consequences was physical. There were spankings, there was a lot of abuse that I had to get over. There was physical and emotional abuse. And, they, they swung the pendulum all the way to the right, way too far, and I think parents, everybody has their childhood, right? And some of our childhoods were great, some of them sucked, and I attribute a lot of what my sister and I went through as in that my parents probably didn't have a good childhood. Parents parent the way they were parented, basically, unless you can recognize, oops, I didn't like my childhood, so therefore I'm not going to do A, B, and C that they did, and I'm going to learn how to break that generational curse. But one of the things that was there that was good is there was a parent-child relationship, and they weren't trying to make me happy. They weren't trying to be my friend. They were being my parent, and they were teaching me life skills and teaching me not to lie, not to steal, and to be a good human. And I think that has changed somehow. It's morphed into, I want to be your best friend. You're my best friend. And it's like, you're not doing your children any favors by setting up that kind of a relationship, right?
You're not. And I think you're exactly right. When you were talking about the pendulum, I think we often see this generationally. The generation after will then go so far the other way. So
Right.
there were probably homes that were unsafe and were abusive decades ago. And we recognized, hey, that's not a good plan. But what happened is now there's so much over here with gentle parenting and not wanting to intervene. And we've got to find our way to the sensible middle that says, you
Right.
are a position of influence in your child's life. And it's okay to do that carefully and with emotional intelligence and not just be a dictator.
Right.
And finding that balance is really what I love to help parents with, because you're exactly right. We can fall in the ditch on either side, and we have to be careful of that.
Well, I think emotional intelligence is a huge topic, and it's something that needs to be spoken about. In parents, let's just say married couples drag emotional baggage into their marriage that's unresolved, right? And it's, to a large degree, it's unresolved because the emotional intelligence is just not there. They don't, a lot of times people don't even know there's emotional baggage or what to do about it, right? And it rears its ugly head when you're in the middle of a relationship, and all of a sudden your wife or your husband looks at you and go, I didn't appreciate what you just said or what you just did, and this is how it affects me and how it affects our marriage. And then so you have to hopefully, you know calmly talk through the issues and figure out what's going on. And maybe sometimes it requires talking to a life coach or talking to a family therapist or a marriage counselor, or pastoral care at your church or whatever. And there's nothing, we're all human, right? We're not perfect. We're fallible. We make mistakes. We drag all this stuff into our relationships, and we're broken people, right? And so, I mean, that's one of the beautiful things about church, Focus on the Family, and all these different organizations that are there to support families and support parents and to support raising, adult children and all that stuff. I just started on a rampage there, didn't I? Or rant, not a rampage. I just started on a
Rant.
rant.
All right. Happens to the best of us.
Yeah. So this is good stuff. So how should parents handle situations where their adult child makes decisions that conflicts with their values?
Well, this will depend a little bit on whether your adult child is still in your home. You have a little more leverage there
Right.
because you're providing them a place to live. So, this is so hard for parents, but they have to understand that if you've got a child at home and they're making decisions that really just do not work for you, whether that's because of your beliefs or generic family values or whatever it might be, you do have the ability to put some boundaries around that. Like, hey, this behavior, you're welcome to choose that behavior, but you can't choose that and still live here. That's one way. Other families allow those things, and that's a choice. I'm not excited about it because I think what we really have to convey to kids who are making poor decisions is that I still love you no matter what. And it's okay for me to have my own boundaries around that. So if my child's doing something in my home that's uncomfortable for me, I have the absolute right to say that can't happen in my home. Now, when your kids are not living with you, it's a lot different.
Right.
You are welcome to let them know, and they probably already know what you think, but I always make sure my kids know where I stand on things. We're not shy about it, we're not subtle about it, but I also am very aware that I may not be able to affect change. And I will even say that to them. I understand that you are an adult now. You are able to make this decision. I also want you to know it doesn't impact my feelings about you. I love you to pieces. I
Right.
am a fan of you. I'm in your corner. That said, I need you to know this doesn't match our paradigm, and here's why. I even will go so far for some of my more cerebral kids. I have one that's very analytical. I will bring in the research and say, this choice you're making, the research says it's not great, and here's why. And I also don't believe it's moral, but let me tell you what even the social scientists are saying, or whatever it might be. If you've got a kid who does better with higher reasoning, you can even appeal to that and say, here's statistically why this isn't a great plan. So there's lots of ways to approach that, but I do think it depends whether they're in your home or not, because you have a different leverage when they've already moved out, and it's a lot less.
Right. Well, Deana, I think we could probably talk for another 2 hours, but there's so much we haven't touched on that maybe we can have another conversation at another time and talk about some of these other things that are on my list here. So I'm going to say at this point, and that brings us to the end of another episode of ABCs of Parenting Adult Children. Big thank you to Deana Thayer for sharing her experience, wisdom, and heart with us today. Deana's insights remind us that parenting doesn't stop when our kids grow up. It simply changes shape. If today's episode resonated with you, be sure to follow or subscribe so that you never miss an episode. And if you know someone navigating the challenges of parenting adult children, share this episode with them. It might just be what they need to hear. You can find more resources, past episodes, and ways to connect with us at my website at parentingadultchildren.org. Follow us on Instagram at parentingadultchildren. And if you have a story or question you'd like to share, send me an email at talkpac@proton.me. Talkpac@proton.me. And Deana, thank you for being here. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you for having me and shining a light on all these important topics. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. And to the listening audience, I'll say thank you for the privilege of your time. Have a wonderful day. Share this episode with everybody that you know, your parents, parenting friends, family, and coworkers, right? Have a wonderful day. And thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.
Please tune in next week for another episode of our podcast on parenting adult children.